First question tonight comes from Thomas Giesekamp.
Turning back the boats saved lives. Offshore detention and processing gave the Australian government time to do their checks. Now that the offshore detention centres are closing and the remaining refugees are not allowed into Australia, how can we be humanely resettled overseas?
Jim Molan.
That's a good question, and that's a question which I think everyone is concerned with at the moment. We have set in place a process that has worked. Every Australian should be extraordinarily proud of not just 50, 70, 80 years of migration policy, but what Operation Sovereign Borders has achieved. There are choices for those on Nauru and Manus, and those choices are, if you're a refugee, then you settle in those countries or other countries that will take you. If you're not a refugee, you go home. In the meantime, we should treat those people with the respect and the security and the safety that they deserve.
So, Jim, did you ever envisage that people with legitimate refugee camps would be stuck indefinitely in offshore detention centres?
We always knew that the offshore processing part and Operation Sovereign Borders was based on three factors. The first was stopping the boats, the second was temporary protection visas, and the third was offshore processing. We always knew that offshore processing would be the hardest part of what we had to do.
Shen.
Well, I think to say something has worked, it can't include the institutional abuse of men, women and children. And I think the problem that we've got now is that what we're doing currently, which is, as you've just pointed out, keeping people in offshore detention for years on end in a way that's completely unlawful and obviously exposes them to abuse, is the only way possible for this country to deal with the small number of people who come here by boat. And I think the problem that we've got is that what the entire context that Jim Nolan is talking about relies on is the Australian public not knowing one clear fact. And that is that over the last 15 years in Australia, we have seen the highest proportionate intake of immigrants this country has seen. In the year 2013, when many of these people who arrived by boat came, 25,000 in fact, we had 800,000 people coming through our arrival terminals in our airports every single day. So when you think about that and when you understand the context of that, that's 2,300 people coming every day. You ask yourself, is the only way to deal with a proportionately smaller number of people coming in a dangerous way to imprison them for years on end in a remote Pacific island?
We're going to come back to that issue with some questions from the floor, but let me just ask you this quick one because it was built into the premise of Audrey's question there. Do you accept the premise that turning back the boats save lives?
Well, I think part of the problem is we don't have all of the facts. If you've got a situation where there is incredible secrecy about Operation Sovereign Borders, where you have doctors taking the government to the High Court because of the levels of secrecy and inability that they have to tell their case about what's really happening to the Australian public, I think the problem is we don't really know. But what I can posit as a possibility is, if we understand that someone coming on a leaky boat is fundamentally dangerous, which I think we all can, then you've got to ask the question, pushing that boat back from Australian waters into the open sea but somebody else's waters, is that likely to be any more safe? And I don't think that answer is adequately been...
Let's hear from the rest of the panel, and Frank Brennan, I'll go to you first.
Well, I'd start by saying, Jim, I'm not a proud Australian on this at all.
That's a shame, Frank, a real shame.
Well, I'll tell you, I'm very ashamed, and I'll explain why. Basically, what happened in 2013, yes, there were lots of boats coming. And Rudd, Prime Minister, said, we're going to stop this. So he cut a deal first with Papua New Guinea. And as you know, the idea was at Papua New Guinea that single men would be sent to Papua New Guinea. He then cut a separate deal with Nauru. And the idea was that people, including women and children, would be sent to Nauru. And as you know, Jim, the Memorandum of Understanding negotiated with Nauru and signed off on was very different from the one from PNG. Why? Because what it said was this. It said, right, Nauru is a country of only 10,000 people. We Australians think we've got a big problem. We're going to ship people off to Nauru. And here we are 3 years on. The majority of those on Nauru are now proven refugees, okay? They've established their claim. Under the Memorandum of Understanding, what was agreed was this. Nauru said under the MOU, each year we will indicate how many people we can absorb. And the rest of the caseload, Australia will share the responsibility for finding somewhere to resettle them. And furthermore, those who are found not to be refugees, then Australia would share the responsibility. If those people couldn't be safely returned home, then Australia would share the responsibility to settle them. So I will be a proud Australian after 3 years of this if we can get to the stage where our major political parties say, look, 3.5 years on, we've had enough of this. The boats have stopped, but basically it's time for these people to be resettled. And the other thing, if I may, I don't want to go on too long, but
briefly,
one other point. As you know, Jim, 2012 expert panel set up by Angus Houston, who you would respect greatly, head of the military forces, Michael Lestrange, who'd been the head of DFAT, they said at that stage you could not safely and legally turn back boats. Houston knew you couldn't safely turn back boats then. Lestrange knew you couldn't do it legally. Now, what we've got now is government saying it can be done.
It's been done.
Well,
it's been done numerous times safely.
Therefore, why do we continue to keep proven refugees who are children after 3 years on Nauru?
I'll let Jim Boland. So much of that was directed to you. I think you should respond.
Thank you. Briefly. There really is no desire at all from anyone I've spoken to, pretty well in either party, to hold people on either of those two islands. The whole idea is to get them off and to move them somewhere else. We don't know.
Jim, what about the New Zealand idea? Because they did actually offer to take some of these people.
They did, and during Howard's time, they took 150 of them.
So was that a mistake?
No, I don't know. None of us really know the reason for that. I can only suspect that the reason was that in 3 years' time after they go to New Zealand, they come to us. They have the right to come to Australia. So you are then handing to a people smuggler somewhere in Java something to sell, and that's what we've got to avoid. There are 14,000 people waiting in Java for a sign of weakness when if those good people who are trying to weaken our border protection at the moment, we tried this before, we tried it in 2008, it did not work then, it's unlikely to work now.
Thank you, Jim. I'm going to go to someone who actually did come here on a boat. So, Hugh, did you weaken our border security?
Obviously, Tony. That's why. Look, I will come to the personal experience in a moment, but I find this whole discussion a really sort of sad discussion. It sort of just feels like it's our version of the Trump-Mexican wall, that we put up to handle what's a very small number of people. We spent $10 billion, Jim, over the course of the last 3 years. When you look at the budgetary pressures that we have, it's an enormous amount of money for to so-called stop the boat. Surely there were and will be better ways to do that. Personally, I don't think stopping the boats in the way that we have personally that in any way has advanced the country's cause in terms of our overall security. Our economic cause in terms of getting people into the country who really want to make a contribution, when I think about and it seems like a temporary solution because as soon as it's $1.5 billion, I think if I look at the budget papers that we'll have to keep spending every year just to maintain this solution. So it's a really expensive. But getting back to Tony's question about our experience coming. So we came in 1978. We escaped from Vietnam post-Indochina War, sort of Vietnam War and part of the Indochinese wave of refugees. We made our way from Saigon down through Malaysia, Singapore, across to Indonesia, and then tried to get across to Darwin on 3 different occasions. And on each occasion, our boat took in too much water and we ultimately had to turn around. And my father then who had a smattering of English, wrote a letter to the Australian Embassy in Jakarta, and then we ultimately got processed by UNHCR out of a refugee camp there, and then came out to Australia. Now, so I have enormous sympathy about not having people hop onto boats unnecessarily. Now, we knew the risk, but the risk of persecution in Vietnam for... my father was a Chinese heritage business person, so all his former colleagues were getting sent to re-education camps. So the risk of staying versus getting onto a boat, you know, if you were faced with that real choice to make, I almost guarantee, particularly if you're a parent, that you know which choice you make. You'll take the risk and you'll get on that boat. So, so we took that risk, but I think now there's probably a better solution to do that. So than to have people get on boats. In Jakarta, we were in the camp for about 3 months. We got them processed very efficiently. We had a couple of countries in which we could go to, and we ended up coming to Australia. And I think our family and our extended family have since made a solid contribution to Australia. And I'd love to think that, in fact, that you know, people now who have that choice to make and then get accepted by Australia will become the most fiercely loyal Australians and then make a contribution that way. And I can't for the life of me understand why we are taking the approach that we are taking. There will be, if we turn our minds to a better way of stopping people taking those risks.
And what is that, Hugh? What's the better way?
I'm sure we're going to get to that, Tony, in due course.
Well, we will.
Come on.
It's probably best that we allow the discussion to unfold, Jim, in that regard. But I haven't heard from Jane McAdam. We'll hear from you quickly, and we've got another question, a video question, in fact.
Thanks, Tony. I think the first thing to do here is to reframe the discussion. We shouldn't be framing this constantly as a security issue about how we shut down our borders and deter people, how we contain them, but rather how do we facilitate safe, lawful pathways for people who, as Hugh just said, are desperately in need of assistance. I think, as he said, we would like to hope that if we ever found ourselves in the same position, that we wouldn't be turned away as we desperately need protection. The other point I'd make here is Hugh mentioned the costs. In 2013 to 14, Australia spent the same amount of money on offshore processing, Operation Sovereign Borders and the like for a few thousand people as the whole UN Refugee Agency had to care for, at that time, some 50 million displaced people. That is the kind of money that we are spending to stop people who need safety and assistance from getting it, and instead that money could be so much better spent in to assist people to actually find safe ways to bring them here. And there are we will get to those alternatives, I'm quite sure, but a very simple one would be this. Australia imposes carrier sanctions on airlines that bring people here without a visa. In the Mediterranean, it's €35 for people to safely get on a ferry and cross that stretch of water, but they're paying up to $10,000 to engage people smugglers precisely because the ferries will be penalised financially if they bring people who don't have the right paperwork. Now, that is something that could be stopped tomorrow, but of course, governments have decided they don't want to do that. There are many other alternatives.
We'll come back to that, and I'm just going to give Jim 30 seconds to just... you wanted to jump in and respond. Please do, but do it quickly.
Thank you. Jane mentioned this, that we need a safe, lawful pathway. Well, of course, we've got one. We've got a safe, lawful pathway for 13,750 people each and every year. We're about to expand that to 19,000 people. That goes on and on and on, not just one-off, but each and every year. There is a safe, lawful pathway to come to Australia, and it's being exercised each and every day.
But Jim, we're facing a once-in-a-lifetime or once-in-a-generational displacement crisis, if you look at the numbers worldwide. And Australia has barely increased its resettlement intake in the last decades.
OK, we're going to come to that.